This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where's the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason. So if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 44 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is December 14th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. On the last historical episode, we had Joe and Rigdon fleeing from Kirtland, Ohio, and finally arriving in far west Missouri. Once they arrived, they essentially threw over the whole game board that had been put in place by Dub Phelps and Ollie Cowdung and many others in the Whitmers in far west, and basically set up a whole new game, a new strategy, new everything. People weren't so happy about this. The Whitmers, as well as Leadfoot Lyman Johnson and Ollie Cowdung and, Dub Phelps, they were all essentially excommunicated from the church. There was a grand cleansing to purge all of those who dare question the authority of his prophet and his advisors. Of course, Hingepin Rigdon issued a couple of public death threats. Initially, there was the Salt Sermon, and then there was his 4th of July oration after that, which essentially said, we will have a war of extermination between us and the Missourians. If you are a Patreon subscriber, of course, you had access to the entire 4th of July oration, which was much longer than initially expected. It was like 13 pages long. I thought it was just a couple of excerpts. But that wraps it up for the milk for today's episode. Let's just jump right on into the meat. Before getting started today, I do have to let everybody know I've recently run into what could be called computer problems, and I've essentially lost a bit of data. So unfortunately, this episode I am not quite as well prepared for as I normally like to be, but we're just going to kind of fly with it and see how it goes. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you will you'll get the entire rundown of what happened. It's really quite absurd. But let's get started with this week's episode. Tensions were high between the Mormons and the Missourians after Rigdon's read sermon. Many Missourians were totally cool with the Mormons as long as the Mormons kept to themselves. But the leadership had no intention of doing so. Now, this is a quote from the Richmond court proceedings that happened in November of 1838. I'm going to read a few excerpts from here. Quote, as early as April last, at a meeting in Far West of 8 or 12 persons, Mr. Rigdon arose and made an address to them in which he spoke of having borne persecutions and lawsuits and other privations, and did not intend to bear them any longer. That they meant to resist the law, and if a sheriff came after them with writs, they would kill him. And if anybody opposed them, they would take off their heads. George W. Harris, who was present, observed, you meant the heads of their influence, I suppose? Rigdon answered, he meant that lump of flesh and bones called the skull or scalp. End quote. So that's not an idle death threat. If anybody comes into Far West claiming that they have writs of arrest for Rigdon, for Joe, for anybody, that they will kill them. Simple as that. Sidney Rigdon said that from the stand. This is another quote from a man named Robert Snodgrass at the same court hearing, and he's quoting Joe here at this time. Quote, that the time had now come that the saints should rise and take the kingdom, and they should do it by the sword of the Spirit, and if not, by the sword of power. End quote. And after Leadfoot Lyman Johnson had been excommunicated and exiled from far west, a friend of his named George Walter quoted Joe in saying, quote, it is a time of war, and to permit persons who are right in among them to go out and carry news would never do it by taking their lives. The militia was nothing but a mob, that the state of Missouri was a mob, and that the governor himself was a mob character. It is time to lay religion aside and take up our guns. End quote. That's Joe saying these things. Lay our religion aside and take up our guns. This is a quote from a man named George Hinkle at the same court proceedings. And he is quoting Joe saying, quote, he believes Muhammad was a good man, that the Quran was not a true thing, but the world believed Muhammad as they believed in him, and that he believed Muhammad a true prophet, end quote. Now, why the fuck would Joe call Muhammad a good guy? Why would he think that Muhammad, of all people, who we've come to know synonymously with terrorist attacks nowadays, Joe was calling him a cool guy? Really, really incredible, isn't it? We'll get into why I think Joe was revering Muhammad in a minute here. But here's another quote from a man named Samuel Kimball, and he told of Joe standing in front of an armed mob in Far West, and this is probably the Danites. I can't assume that there was a separate armed mob in the Mormon movement. It was just the Danites, essentially, but that's what Joe was standing up in front of the armed Danites saying this, quote, it was impossible to please a mob, that he had applied to the governor, that he understood the governor, said he could do nothing for us. He said the whole state was a mob, and that the governor was nothing but a mob, and if he come upon them, he would make war upon him. He cursed the state as a damn mob, and that God would damn them. He observed that the people might think he was swearing, but the Lord would not take notice of it. End quote. That's what we're talking about here. Tensions were rising between the Mormons and the Missourians. Now, these are things that Joe and Rigdon were saying from the pulpit. They were preaching these things, calling these people mobs and mobocrats, and essentially vilifying them the way that we might a terrorist nowadays. I mean, think about it. If you can apply the word terrorist to somebody, they become less than human. You can suddenly do all kinds of things, strip away their constitutionally sanctioned rights, imprison them and detain them under habeas corpus without proper trial. I mean, all sorts of things can be done once you dehumanize a subsect of the population. And that's what we've done today by calling people terrorists, and that's what Joe was doing by calling these people mobs. Well, Joe and Rigdon, essentially, any of the leadership of the church, were claiming that it was all of these mobs that were causing the problems. But it wasn't just the Missourians that Rigdon and Joe were railing against. Abner Scoville said this in reference to Rigdon, and he said this soon after Double Dub Phelps and Freddie G. Willie were baptized after their excommunication in April. So Double Dub Phelps, William Wines Phelps, and Freddie G. Willie, Frederick G. Williams, once they were excommunicated, they committed fealty to the church, and they were rebaptized and refellowshipped. And of course, Double Dub Phelps was a prominent member in the church, even into the Brigham Young days. But this is a quote soon after they were refellowshipped and rebaptized. Quote, soon after the time that Phelps and Williams was baptized, about the last of June last, I heard Sidney Rigdon say in Far West that if Phelps or Williams apostatized again or set up against the government or kingdom, the Lord would kill them in half an hour or would put it into the hearts of his saints to kill them. End quote. We're talking life and death here. These are death threats. There's no mixing that. Death threats spoken from the pulpit by religious leaders. That is something that we need to contend with, and we need to keep into this equation that the Mormons were the ones spewing death threats from the pulpit. Of course, the Missourians were threatening death to the Mormons in their own ways, including gathering mobs together and marching on these towns and showing up as a hostile force, essentially claiming to be militias that were state-sanctioned. However, many of them were just mobs of anti-Mormons. So Joe and Rigdon were not tolerant of literally anything that would question their leadership. If people apostatized, they would be chased out of Far West or Carroll County or Daviess County. They'd be chased out of the Mormon settlements there. And if they were not successfully chased out, then they received death threats from the pulpit. This is one of the incredible pressures that really amped up the situation, made it a lot more intense than it should have been. But we have to add that into the amalgamation of all of the social pressures that were causing this. I mean, another one of these causes that we can point to that led to so much chaos at the time was just like desperation for resources. I mean, we know that Joe and Rigdon and many of the Mormon refugees that were moving to Missouri from Ohio and New York, being chased out of the church in Kirtland and whatnot, they had absolutely nothing with them. They were poor and destitute. They brought the clothes on their back. The only thing that Mormons brought with them en masse from Ohio to Missouri was their poverty. Now, poverty today is much different than poverty of the 1830s. I mean, the average person today in poverty has access to resources that the people in the 1830s never did. If those people back then were poor going into the Missouri winter, they very well might not emerge on the other side of that winter with as many numbers as they went into it with. Each person was responsible for gathering enough food stores to last their family for the winter. But when you have thousands of people moving into an area that's already starved for resources, it creates an even deeper vacuum, resulting in people starving, literally starving to death for want of resources. Now, the Mormons, of course, took action so that they didn't starve to death. We'll have to get into those later. But essentially, that is the game board that we're playing with right here. And another piece to this puzzle is the law of consecration. When Joe and Rigdon got to Missouri, they essentially claimed that if you don't pledge yourself to the law of consecration, you're not a member of the church. And that's where we see like Ollie Cowdung saying that you're intermingling church and state too much, and the church shouldn't have any say what I do with my property, because he didn't want to fall under the law of consecration. He didn't want to consecrate all of his possessions to the church in order to be absorbed into the bishop's storehouse and distributed as sees fit. Because, of course, with that situation, the leadership is always going to be better off than the typical everyday average Mormon. They are going to get more share. The leadership, Joe and Rigdon, are going to take care of themselves before they take care of the rest of the flock. And that was important, and the people that were falling under the law of consecration knew that this would be the case, and it was a sticking point for a lot of Mormons. It caused a lot of Mormons to say this really can't be the true church if they're requiring that I give all my possessions to them, literally in violation of my sovereign citizenship, essentially. I mean, this is just one more pressure to add to this crazy puzzle of clusterfuck of what this is. I mean, it's incredible. But of course, when Joe and Rigdon moved to Missouri in January, there were enough people there to support with the few excess resources they had to finish out the winter and then get into the spring of 1838. However, as 1838 progressed, it became abundantly clear that there weren't going to be enough crops in the ground to support the influx of refugees fleeing Ohio. There just was not enough calories. It's a simple math equation. When you don't have enough calories, enough nutrients for everybody that's moving in, you have a big problem. If the Mormon leadership didn't do something, the flock would starve. And everybody that was with them was going into the winter of 1838 to 39. They might not be there in the spring because they starved. Add into the desperation for resources the fact that it was an election year, and we're really seeing this powder keg slowly filling. I mean, it's just like threatening an explosion to take everybody down. The Mormons represented a voting bloc. We got into this a little bit last episode, but they created a voting bloc that just couldn't be ignored by those who were running for any office in the counties north of Jackson County in Missouri. So that's Davies, Carroll, Clay, Caldwell, all of these local counties that were north of Jackson that Mormons were living in. Politicians knew that they had to secure the Mormon vote in order to get elected. Well, Davies County had essentially been sanctioned as Mormonville. And that's where they had reasonable belief that no Missourians would bother the Mormons if they just kept to themselves. But as we know, Joe and Rigdon weren't much for leaving sleeping dogs to lie, and their aggressive expansion upon arrival scared the Missourians that had agreements with the Mormons to stay in Davies, Clay, and Caldwell counties, and so on and so forth. But as this influx of Mormon refugees was injected into the population, politicians began pandering to the Mormons in order to get their vote. The Mormons were made up of a fairly balanced mix of Democrats and Whigs, which means that they were happy to vote as a bloc for anybody that claimed to be on their side, regardless of party affiliation. A man named William Peniston, Peniston. I guess it's better than being named like Penis Feather or something, but William Peniston was a Maine politician who was pandering to the Mormon voting bloc. He was focusing most of his energy on General Lyman White, who was essentially leader or one of the main leaders of the Danites. This is a quote discussing who Peniston was. Quote, Peniston was a rough, quarrelsome fellow, but he had more influence in Davies County in 1838 than any other man, recalled Joseph McKee, who ran a clothing store in Gallatin. Peniston had previously objected to the Saints' immigration into Davies, but when White questioned him regarding his opposition, Peniston replied that he never designed to drive them out of the county, and if he could not scare them so as to cause them to leave, he intended to let them alone. Another non-Mormon resident, perhaps sent by a local candidate, went out among the Saints to find out whom they supported for the county offices. The older settlers realized that whoever received the Mormon vote would win the election. End quote. Now that's from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, page 59 through 60. So when you add vicious politics into this mix, it's like that powder keg from before was just doused in kerosene. Now August 8th, 1838 marked this monumental election that held the fate of the Mormons in Missouri in the balance. Everybody knew it. The Missourians that hated the Mormons had strong motivations to stop their voting, as it would probably influence the next decade of politics, and the Mormons, as well as those non-Mormon Missourians who were sympathetic to the Mormons, knew that if they could just get a few politicians into the office that were on the Mormon side, things might just get a little tiny bit better than the shit sandwich they'd been eating for half of a decade in Missouri. Now, who knows? If enough Mormons and Mormon sympathizers are elected, they may even be reinstated into their homes in Jackson County after having been chased out in 1838, and maybe even bring that mob to justice that chased them out in the first place. Now, these may be pie-in-the-sky hopes, but that was the package that the leadership sold to the members. And that motivated these Mormons and Mormon sympathizers to essentially vote or die, motherfucker, right? So Peniston failed in gaining the Mormon vote. And in typical flip-flopper fashion, as is known with many politicians, he began railing against the Mormons to try and eliminate their influence on the election and get more people that were anti-Mormon to the polls that week. He was running as a Whig, and once Lyman Wight challenged him on his loyalty to the Mormons, Peniston took that as a sign that the Mormons would be voting for his Democratic opponent. On August 8th, Election Day in Gallatin, Peniston stood on an old barrel and began calling the Mormons, quote, horse thieves, liars, counterfeiters, and dupes, and boasted to the crowd that he had previously led a company of men that ordered the saints to leave the county. If we suffer such men as those to vote, you will soon lose your suffrage, end quote. Now, obviously, this is just bullshit fear-mongering, showing Peniston's own desperation to get elected by suppressing the Mormon vote. See, there's so much going into the mix that caused the Mormons and the Missourians to be at odds with each other. But what happened with this August 8th, Peniston standing up on the barrel and preaching that the Mormons are horse thieves and liars, he lit the match. Okay? He stepped down from the barrel and he called everybody in attendance to have a drink. And there were roughly 30 Mormons that were in attendance at that time in Gallatin who were waiting to vote. And as Peniston stepped down, they just stood there in cautious silence, knowing that everybody surrounding them were essentially anti-Mormons and they were in hostile territory. The Missourians passed around the whiskey and began drinking, and then, some of the Mormons may have as well. Of course, we don't really know who was drunk and who wasn't. But then a man named Dick Weldon, who was a good friend of Peniston, boasted joyfully that the Mormons hadn't been allowed to vote in Clay County, quote, no more than the Negroes had, end quote. So Dick was saying, yeah, those Mormons suck. You're right, Peniston. And I just came from Clay County, and the Mormons hadn't been allowed to vote any more than any of the Negroes had been allowed to vote. Like, that's what we're talking. Like, the anti-Mormon sentiment that we're talking about here is just laid bare in front of us. And what's incredible is after he said that, that was the rising of tensions. So after he said that, he turned to a Mormon named Samuel Brown, who was a shoemaker, and this is the exchange between the two of them. Are you a Mormon preacher, sir? Dick asked Brown. Yes, sir, I am, Brown replied. Do you Mormons believe in healing the sick by laying on of hands, speaking in tongues, and casting out devils? Dick said. We do, Brown replied. You are a damned liar! Joseph Smith is a damned imposter! End quote. And at that moment, somebody threw a punch, and our keg exploded. Now, it's recorded that Brown hit Dick, but I'm more inclined to think that Dick was hitting on Brown. Suddenly, 5 Mormons jumped into the fight, trying to pull the men apart, and the whiskeyed-up Missourians thought that they were jumping in to help Brown beat up Dick, and a brawl ensued, and men were kicking and punching and body-slamming each other in just a drunken-fueled rage. Let me read a quote really quick from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, page 62 to 63. Quote, John L. Butler, a large and powerful Mormon, Bear Mormon, rankled at the abuse heaped upon his people. This is now quoting John L. Butler from a later recounting. Quote, the first thing that came to my mind was the covenants entered into by the Danites, to the effect that they were to protect each other, etc. And I hollowed out the top of my voice, saying, oh yes, you Danites, here is a job for us. End quote. Now going back to the Mormon War. When Butler gave the Danite signal of distress, about 10 more Latter-day Saints ran to the defense of their brethren. Seeing this, 40 or 50 Missourians stepped in to battle the Missourians. Now quoting a man named Joseph McKee, quote, "I had witnessed many knockdowns in my time, but none on so grand a scale," wrote Joseph McKee, a non-Mormon observer of the fight. "The participants used no guns, but struck at one another with whips, clubs, rocks, and knives. The Mormons rallied behind Butler, who wielded a large wooden club he found in a nearby pile of wood." Now going back to quoting Butler, quote, "When I called out for the Danites, a power rested upon me, such as one as I have never felt before. I never struck a man the second time, and while knocking them down, I really felt that they would soon embrace the gospel." End quote. He was using the stick of Joseph to proselyte. Oh, it's incredible. This John L. Butler, he was involved in this scrap, and he is the guy who said, "Oh yes, you Danites, here is a job for us." Now, if you are a Missourian and you've heard rumors about this death cult Mormons, and, you know, you've been associating with the Mormons, or you've been associating with, you know, anti-Mormon mobs, or whatever the case may be, and you hear that they have a death squad called the Danites, who were issuing death threats, and then a brawl ensues, and you hear a man say, "Danites, here's a job for us." What do you think? What goes through your mind? If you're in the middle of swinging a fist at a Mormon, and another Mormon comes running in with a club, swinging at you, saying, "Let's kill them, Danites," what do you do? Especially, I love Butler. You know, eventually, I really felt that they would soon embrace the gospel. I just love that quote so much. Okay, so after this brawl here, as it ensued, I guess, our match lighter, Peniston, who'd stood up on the barrel and essentially started the anti-Mormon rallying at the time, he ran away at the first signs of brawling. Of course, he was scared for his life because he was the face of the anti-Mormon mob. He was the guy that was essentially organizing them de facto because he was preaching on top of a barrel. So Peniston had run away. Dick Weldon laid unconscious and bleeding from a massive gash in his head. That was probably done at the hand of Butler's wooden club here. And then one of the Mormons, I couldn't figure out a name on this guy, but he retreated with a knife between his shoulder blades. And everybody that was involved in the scrap had bruises and gashes and scrapes, but nobody was fatally wounded. Nobody was killed. But despite being outnumbered, the Mormons somehow stood their ground, and the Missourians dispersed momentarily. But that allowed the Mormons to regroup and assess the situation, and they realized that some of the Missourians were only running so that they could go grab their guns and return to the fight, and turn this from a brawl into, essentially, a slaughter. And at that moment, after kind of regrouping, they collectively decided it was a good idea to run away. And they did. And this was the Gallatin Election Day battle. And it marked the beginning of actual mob violence between the Mormons and Missourians. Now, in 1833, when the Mormons had been chased out of Jackson County, of course, one person had been killed, a few had been shot, many had been whipped out in the streets and beaten with rocks. I mean, it was a really unpleasant situation. The Mormons just suffered the wrath of that, essentially, and they didn't win. And, of course, the sentiment that we need to reinstate the Missourians back into their homes in Jackson County, back in Zion, that was one more piece to add to this puzzle of social pressures that were pushing on the Mormons and the Missourians. But this actual Gallatin Election Day battle, that's what it's called. Even though it's a brawl, it is called a battle. This is essentially where things kicked off. The keg had exploded. And now it was just kind of like a pile of burning wood, but nobody realized that it had exploded like inside of like a fort's powder magazine. The damage was much worse than anybody could understand and realize. until things continued to escalate. People didn't realize that this marked the beginning of some serious violence, serious fighting. And we'll discuss that as we get further along. But now that the fight had broken out, the rhetoric that both sides had been firing at each other for the past 6-8 months, however, or I guess you could probably trace it all the way back to 1831 or 32 when the Mormons were essentially settling in Missouri. They'd been spouting rhetoric about Zion and about the promised land and them taking it by force, essentially. And now that rhetoric that the Mormons were shouting at the Missourians, or shouting at themselves, talking about the Missourians, was realized. It was brought into reality. And the Missourians, knowing that the Mormons are this crazy religious cult and they have this death squad known as the Danites, they heard about this Gallatin election day battle, and they realize, holy shit, the Mormons are a much bigger problem than we ever anticipated. We have some real problems that we need to deal with now. So once word had returned to the respective leaders of the Missourians and the Mormons, suddenly both groups had license to act upon everything they'd been preaching in city council meetings and from the pulpit over the congregations. Nothing happened to de-escalate the situation, and the Missouri mobs, along with Joe and Rigdon, felt justified in using their own mobs to affect influence upon each other now. I remember being in, this is probably 3rd or 4th grade, we would, once a month or once every 2 months, we would have our, the school psychologist come in and just give, a 30-minute presentation or whatever the case may be. And one of those presentations, I still remember it to this day, was talking about gang violence, essentially. And I remember her giving the example of, if you get in a fight with somebody and, a bully somebody, and then, the person that is affected goes and gets their friends gathered, and then they go and confront the person that bullied them in the first place. And then it escalates from there, right? Eventually, if they act in some way to harm the bully that hurt the person in the first place, then that bully will go grab their friends and gather together, and suddenly you have tribes balkanized against each other, right? You have two groups that are diametrically opposed to each other that can't reconcile their differences, and escalation is the word that we apply to this. There's nothing that helped to de-escalate the situation. And I remember that as a very harsh lesson, because it seems like as soon as things begin to spiral out of control, you're just, that's it. You're locked in a death spiral and there's no way to get out of it, right? You start gathering together, larger and larger groups of people to march against or to rally against another larger group of people. Suddenly, we're not talking about two people having a fight. We're talking about two leaders of large gangs or mobs essentially fighting each other. And that's what we're seeing here. Nobody acted in any way to try and de-escalate the situation, with a very few small exceptions. But everything that we see from here until the end of 1838 to the beginning of 1839, things were just ramping up in the scary zone. Things were just getting worse and worse on the rationality spectrum. They're just getting further and further away from what would be a rational or intelligent move to try and reconcile and de-escalate the situation. But given the bullshit rhetoric that we were reading at the beginning of the episode, doesn't this just seem exactly like what Rigdon and Joe were hoping for? Right? I mean, Joe revered Muhammad because he was a prophet and a warlord. If anybody talked shit about Mo, they were dead. Even today, if a lot of people will talk shit about Mo, they could die, depending on where you are, right? But just like Joe wanted for all the people that were shit-talking him and the Mormons, he wanted them to die. So now we have a foundation for these things that Joe was saying from the pulpit. Let me go back to a couple of them and read some small excerpts. It is time to lay religion aside and take up our guns. He believes Muhammad was a good man, that the Quran was not a true thing, but the world believed Muhammad as they believed in him, and he believed Muhammad a true prophet. And then, of course, Rigdon saying that he meant to resist the law, and if a sheriff came after them with writs, he would kill them. I mean, all of these things, these rhetorical devices that Joe and Rigdon were spouting aimlessly from the pulpit, this is exactly what they wanted, isn't it? This is exactly what they were expecting. Rigdon called for a war of extermination. Repeatedly. It wasn't just his 4th of July oration. He kept spouting that shit because people loved it. I mean, he would no longer follow the directions of a sheriff, threatening to kill any of them that attempted to arrest him. Now, any legal actions taken against the Mormons, Rigdon effectively couched it as religious persecution, even though the religious part of it was a very small piece of the broader puzzle of all of those social pressures. Now, this Gallatin election battle made everything real. I mean, a catalyst like this was everybody's wet dream. Finally, the Missourians had an actual act of aggression from the Mormons they could point to in order to legally justify raising an official militia to combat them. And finally, so long after being chased out of Jackson County by a mob, the Mormons could point to the Missourians mobbing against them to eradicate their vote, which is essentially tyrannical and treasonous in and of itself, right? If you're curtailing or reducing somebody's voting power, that's an act of tyranny or treason. It's taking away their constitutionally sanctioned right to vote. And finally, when you have tyranny and treason like this added into the rhetoric, it just justifies everything that they founded the Danites for in the first place, to fight against anti-Mormons. Whether those anti-Mormons came from within the ranks and they were excommunicated and needed to be chased out of a town, like, Cowdery and the Whitmers and so on and so forth, Leadfoot, Lyman, Johnson, or they were anti-Mormon Missourians that really just hated the Mormons. The Danites now had a true calling. And the most terrifying part of everything that was going on here is the misinformation spread in the month following the brawl. Listen into the bonus of this episode to hear one of those. There's a man named Josiah Morin. He was a Mormon who won the election against Peniston for the Senate in Gallatin. So yes, we can rest assured that Peniston, the guy that essentially lit the powder keg on Gallatin election day, he lost the fight. He lost his election to a Mormon named Josiah Morin. He rode into Far West on August 6th, the day of the election battle, whatever you want to call it. He claimed that there was a battle at Gallatin and that 2 Mormons had died, and that the Missourians there were refusing them a proper burial. They were holding the bodies there, essentially. He also spread rumors that there was a mob forming to drive the Saints from Daviess County, just as they had been driven from Jackson County 5 years prior. Now, there was no foundation for his claims. He was just spreading false information. He'd probably just heard this from a friend who told him about his dad or something that was there. Who knows? But Morin wasn't even at Gallatin that day to be a reliable first-hand witness. But the Mormons weren't the only ones working on false information. Rumors were spreading to Jackson and Ray counties that an epic battle between the Mormons and Missourians had ensued, and that the Danites had killed a number of Missourians before retreating back to headquarters in Far West, where they were fortifying for a siege, getting ready for the mob to march on Far West. Now, of course, DeWitt in Carroll County, the town of DeWitt, was also a problem, as the Mormons there had been threatened by the nearby Missouri mob. Once the Mormons living in DeWitt heard about 2 Mormons being killed in Gallatin, Those people were put on red alert awaiting the march of a mob on the little Mormon settlement there in DeWitt. There were only 2 families there at the time. I mean, everybody was intensely terrified about what the next day would hold. Now, John Butler, the Bear Mormon, who was just swinging his club around and fucking everybody up, he arrived in Far West to tell his first-hand account of the fight at Gallatin. Now, he was able to ease the collective fear that Mormons had died in the fight, but that corrected information would take some time to spread to all of the counties in Missouri that were still operating under the false information that 2 Mormons had been killed, or, multiple Missourians had been killed, or whichever side of the fight you landed on. Now, most people were still operating under the assumption that this was an actual bloody and fatal battle, as opposed to just a bunch of drunk men throwing fisticuffs. Now, upon receiving this corrected information from the Bear Mormon, Joe did exactly what would be expected. He called together his counselors, Rigdon and his older brother Hiram, and all of the Danites in Far West, and rode immediately for Diahmen in Daviess County, where Butler had told of a mob of 30 men surrounding his home. Now, of course, expecting an armed mob of Missourians to march on Diahmen, where most of the brawlers had fled to after Gallatin, they fortified the town of Diahmen and cooked up a large batch of cornmeal and meat in preparation for a siege that night. But it was false information, and no mob actually appeared to lay siege to the town that night. But of course, Joe woke up the next morning and walked around, and he looked around the town and saw, nothing had happened in the night. Everybody was okay. There was no mob out in the brush or out in the trees on the outskirts of town that were waiting to siege the town. He must have thought to himself, well, I have this mob of 150 armed men. Now what do I do with them? The answer is as appalling as it is expected. Joe decided to visit? Yeah, that's a good word. Visit some prominent Missourians that were living in Daviess County to see if they supported the Mormons or if they would support a mob chasing the Mormons out of Daviess County. Now, if you're just a person that happens to be a judge or a sheriff or, God forbid, a politician in Daviess County, it's incumbent upon you to try your best to be objective and not be swayed to one side or the other in large public conflicts like this between the Mormons and Missourians. Well, Judge Adam Black was one of these people. Black lived less than a mile from the center of Diahmen, being one of the earliest settlers in the area, long before it was designated as Mormonville and even called Daviess County. Black had affiliated with an anti-Mormon mob earlier in the year, and Joe was anticipating his participation in another mob now that all of the shit was on fire after Gallatin. So Joe sent the Danites to deal with Justice Adam Black. So General Lyman White, Dr. Samson Avard, and Cornelius P. Lott, 3 very heavy hitters of the Danites, 3 main leaders of the Danites, along with a small contingency of participants in the Gallatin election battle, went to Judge Black's house. Now, let's just take a second there, because that's some scary shit, okay? Last episode, I made an analogy of what this might look like today. And it sounded a little racist when I was listening back to it, but it's not racist, it's realist, unfortunately. And the analogy is, if somebody named, like Abu Bashida or something like that moved to Iowa, one of the plains states that's not very well populated, and begins gathering people, immigrants from not Iowa, and begins recruiting and proselyting people, and, gains a following of more than 1,000 or a couple thousand people, as the Mormons had at this time. And let's say Abu Bashida says, I am going to raise up an army of armed men with, cutting edge technology and use them as a mob to affect political change. That would scare some people, okay? Just the sheer presence of a religious cult cropping up in an area nearby that is part of a religion that you don't agree with, or you have some fundamental disagreement with, or let's say is doing some of the shit that Joe and Rigdon were doing, preaching war of extermination, calling for mob violence against their oppressors. If we had that today, how long would it take for a massive contingency of soldiers and tanks to surround that camp and arrest everybody there and send them off to Guantanamo, right? I mean, how long would it take for that to happen? Not long. I mean, the public outrage would be insane. Now, what if that leader, the Abu Bashida, took a group of, a small group of men who had just participated in a brawl, from stopping people from casting their votes, essentially, an act of tyranny. He took a small contingency of men to a justice of the peace's house and went into his house and intimidated him there. What how would we react today? I mean, if Abu Bashida just showed up at the Attorney General's office or at a governor's office or something to that effect, people would lose their fucking minds, right? People's brains would just explode. How long before this would turn into a vigilante mob that would essentially rise up of just, crazy rednecks that would surround the camp with their own guns? I mean, government sanctioned or not, there's just no way that we can see an analogy to this, but this was the harsh day-to-day reality that the Mormons and the Missourians were dealing with in interactions with each other. Now, they, of course, up until Gallatin election battle, they didn't have any mob violence that gave them carte blanche to continue escalating the mob violence. But once Gallatin election day happened, all bets are off, right? The gloves are off. They're on the ground. We're going bare knuckle now. We're actually getting into real change, real public change being affected by mobs. And that's what's so scary. So this small force of the Danites, who were known publicly as the Mormon Hit Squad, arrived at Judge Black's house. Now, I mean, and some of these were even people that had participated in the Gallatin Election Day battle. So they presented him with a written agreement stating that Black would disavow any affiliation with anti-Mormon Missourians and would essentially pledge fealty to the Mormons, or at very least sympathy. Now, of course, Black, having led an anti-Mormon mob himself before this and just disliking the Mormons already, he refused to sign it indignantly. He was very powerfully opposed to signing this, claiming that the Mormons had no right to require a justice of the peace to sign such a document. And rightfully so. I mean, given constitutional rights and I assume what was Missouri law, you can't just gather a mob of people and march on a judge's home and say, you need to sign this piece of paper that says you're not going to fuck with us. That's never going to work. That's not how you affect political change. So the Danites left Black's home in frustration because he refused it, only to return soon after for a second attempt at persuasion, and Black refused again, vehemently this time. Now, not taking his refusals lying down, Joe decided, instead of sending Lyman White, Samson Avard, Cornelius Lott, and some other people that were members of the Danites, he decided, I'm going to go see that motherfucker for myself. So he gathered 100 armed men from the 150 contingency that was in Daviess County at the time, most of them being Danites, and they surrounded Judge Adam Black's home. The prophet of the church, Joseph Smith, along with 100 armed men, most of them pledging loyalty to the prophet until death, surrounded the home of a public elected official, saying, "You need to sign our shit or violence will happen." Now, of course, Dr. Samson Avard, being one of the heads of the Danites and a brutally intimidating man, was chosen to be spokesperson of the mob to Black. He was essentially the liaison, and he said this to Black, quote, "We have come to be plain with you. The only alternative is for you to sign this obligation," end quote. Black refused again. He was sticking to his guns, as he rightfully should. A justice of the peace is supposed to do that. So he refused again, and Avard told him that the prophet is waiting outside to speak with Justice Black, should he continue to refuse. Black asked Avard if Joe, quote, shared Avard's savage disposition, end quote, to which the reply was negative. So Black said, "I'm not going to deal with this Samson Avard asshole guy. I'm going to go out and talk to the prophet himself." So Black exited his home and was greeted by the 100-strong armed mob surrounding his house, just standing there in dead silence. Of course, Joe was standing in front of the door, and Black walked up to Joe, and Joe said to him, quote, "They would not compel Black to act against his will, but asked that he sign to allay the excitement among the local Mormons who feared anti-Mormon violence," end quote. So we're seeing what happens here. Joe and Avard, essentially did some good cop, bad cop shit, right? Avard came in there with his group of people and said, "You have to sign this or there will be violence. The only alternative is for you to sign this obligation." He was the hard sell. And then Black said, no, I'm not going to do it. So he walks out to Joe, and Joe said, "Hey, look, it's not that we want you to be a Mormon. It's not like we want you to march with us against the anti-Mormon mobs. It's just that we want you to sign this so that the Mormons will no longer fear anti-Mormon violence." Which seems reasonable, right? And it worked. Yeah, sort of. Black still refused to sign the prepared statement that the Mormons had brought with them. Instead, he wrote his own statement, which reads, quote, "I, Adam Black, a justice of the peace of Daviess County, do hereby certify to the people called Mormon that he is bound to support the Constitution of this state and of the United States, and he is not attached to any mob, nor will not attach himself to any such people, and so long as they will not molest me, I will not molest them. This, the 8th day of August, 1838, signed Adam Black, Justice of the Peace," end quote. And of course, the Danites weren't done. They considered this essentially a satisfactory victory over their persecutors. So they went and visited a number of other officials throughout Daviess County, including Sheriff William Morgan. It's unclear how many they actually visited and how many signed any written agreements, but they were able to get some of these people to sign these official statements that were really similar to that of Adam Black's. But the underlying theme was they were signed against their will. Okay? If a guy shows up to your house and asks you to sign something you don't want to sign, it's a criminal act. When that guy shows up with 100 armed men, it's a little harder to deny their request, and it's way more criminal. So by compelling these people to sign legal statements at the threat of armed violence with a mob behind him, Joe was merely emulating his hero from earlier, Muhammad. He was using an army to enforce his will. Joe's idle threats of violence were now treading ever closer to the realm of reality. There's no going back. There's no way to de-escalate the situation without somebody's ego being eviscerated and dragged through the mud. Dr. Samson Avar later was quoted on record saying, quote, "If Black had not signed the paper he did, it was the common understanding and belief that he would have shared the fate of the dissenters," end quote. How fucking terrifying is that? If this justice of the peace didn't sign this agreement that we told him to sign under duress against his will, he would meet the same fate as the dissenters. Who knows what that means? Chased out of Daviess County? That's probably, yeah, why not? But you have 100 armed men there. I would think that assassination or, mob violence, some public lynching of the man would probably be a little bit more reasonable in my mind. Or less reasonable, but more realistic. But it's really, really fucked up. Really incredible, actually, to see how Joe was enforcing his will through the use of the mob. I'm going to read a quote really quick from Mormoninformation.com. This is the Reed Peck manuscript, and it was sent over by astute listener Lloyd Eldridge. Thank you very much for making me aware of this. I was completely unaware of it. And it's a huge manuscript history of this guy. And we're going to read a couple excerpts from it. I'm going to be relying on it for the next probably few episodes. It's an amazing account. At the end of Lloyd's email, he said, "If you haven't read it, I highly recommend Reed Peck's manuscript. You can find it here." He gave me the link for it, and there will be a link in the show notes. He said, "Stephen LeSueur disagrees with him on a few things, but by and large, pretty credible stuff by an eyewitness of the account." And this is, once again, Lloyd, thank you for sending in this email, and there will be a link for the Reed Peck manuscript in the show notes, where you can find a couple of excerpts I'm going to read from it here. This is the first one, quote, "The blood of my best friend must flow by my own hands if I would be a faithful Danite, should the prophet command it," said A. McCrae in my hearing. "If Joseph should tell me to kill Van Buren in his presidential chain, I would immediately start and do my best to assassinate him, let the consequences be what they would. Having been taught to believe themselves invincible in the defense of their cause, though the combined power of the world were in array against them, and the purposes of God were to be accomplished through their instrumentality, the wicked destroyed, by force of arms, the nations subdued, and the kingdom of Christ established on the earth, they consider themselves accountable only at the bar of God for their conduct, and consequently acknowledged no law superior to the word of the Lord through the prophet." End quote. That is fucking terrifying, isn't it? This guy, A. McCrae, now this is quoted from a first-hand witness who saw this man named A. McCrae say this, but he said this in a public hearing. "If Joe should tell me to kill Van Buren, Martin Van Buren, in his presidential chain, I would immediately start and do my best to assassinate him." That is horrifying. Okay? They acknowledge no law superior to the word of the Lord through the prophet. Now, if you are looking for a flock of zombies that will do whatever you want, I guess all you need is claim to prophethood and your own proprietary holy book. Because Joe made this happen. People were willing to put their lives on the line to assassinate a president of the United States if Joe commanded it. Is it really any question that Adam Black's life was on the line, whether he would have signed that or not? I mean, this is more from the Reed Peck manuscript. Quote, "The forces from Caldwell County remained in Daviess 2 days, and in the time compelled one individual to sign an article binding him to keep the peace with the Mormons, and attempted to frighten a justice of the peace to sign the same, but he drew one himself and signed it, which was satisfactory. Now, that's, of course, talking about the sheriff and Judge Adam Black that the Mormons visited. Reed Peck continues, quote, warrants were issued against Joseph Smith and Lyman White, and many others engaged in this affair, and cause found sufficient to put them under bonds for their appearance at court. Representations of these hostile movements of the Mormons were sent by express to the neighboring counties, which created considerable excitement, and but a short time elapsed before it was rumored that the inhabitants of Daviess County were determined that the Mormons should be expelled from that county, as it would be impossible to live in peace with them. End quote. Now, it's a constitutionally protected right to peacefully assemble. Even if every single person in the assembly is armed to the teeth in their own tank, you can peacefully assemble. But it was against Missouri state law to cross county borders with an armed mob, regardless of its use. Now, given the actions taken by Joe and Samson Avard, Lyman White, Hinchpin Rigdon, Hiram Smith, they crossed county lines with their armed mob and then proceeded to persuade elected officials with the threat of violence from that mob, death threats. This was illegal on many levels, and it can be classified as an act of high treason against the United States government. In response to this newly realized threat, now it's not like they realized it, this threat was realized, it was put into the realm of reality, it was a real threat to them. Representatives from the anti-Mormon Missourians, as well as a number of Mormon leaders, met the following evening in Diahmen to essentially hash out the tension. This is one point that we can look to and say, okay, right here, they did try to de-escalate, but it was all a facade. They met at the home of Lyman White, and they apparently came to some kind of agreement to preserve the peace. Both sides agreed that they wouldn't protect anybody that had acted illegally, and that they would faithfully deliver them over to the proper authorities, regardless of who they were, whether it was Joe and Rigdon or it was Justice Adam Black. Both sides agreed, if somebody acts illegally on our side, we're not going to protect them. This is an agreement that was violated on both sides many times, but they still came to the agreement, a diplomatic understanding between the two sides, and they parted that evening shaking hands on friendly terms. But it wouldn't last long. So following the mob actions at Persuasion, I guess that's a word for it, Persuasion, Judge Black, Colonel Peniston, and a few others rode to Richmond and Jackson counties, spreading rumors of wildly exaggerated reports concerning what had happened in Daviess County. They were claiming that 500 armed Mormons were threatening the lives of Daviess citizens. Now, Peniston, having lost the election because the Mormons hated him, he lost his election to Josiah Morin, who was a Mormon. He claimed that the Mormons intended to, quote, intimidate and drive from the county all the old citizens and possess themselves of their lands, or to force such as do not leave to come into their measures and submit to their dictation, end quote. Essentially, Peniston was claiming that the Mormons were going to do exactly what the Missourians had done to the Mormons in 1833 in Jackson County. Chase out the old citizens, I guess the Mormons weren't old citizens, but possess themselves of their lands, take all their property, crops, food, stores, everything, and then anybody that doesn't leave Daviess County, they have to essentially become Mormon and submit to Mormon dictation, to the Mormon government that Joe and Rigdon were establishing in place of an actual secular government in these counties, especially Caldwell and Daviess counties. Now, with this new information that was blown incredibly out of proportion, the legal counsel in Richmond issued subpoenas to Joe and Rigdon and the leaders of the Danites, as well as anybody they could tie into the Gallatin election fight, or just any of the shit that went down in Daviess County the days following the Gallatin election battle. So essentially, the heaviest hitters in the Mormon Church were issued warrants of arrest and subpoenas to appear before court in Richmond, Ray County, Missouri. A committee was organized to find out the truth of these circumstances and serve the writs of arrest to Joe and others. Now, when they arrived in Millport is in Daviess County, Judge Charles Moorhead told the Mormons there that Mormon lawlessness would not be tolerated. Every Mormon would be killed unless they complied with the laws of the state. Now, that's an important quote, right? That's an actual quote from this Judge Charles Moorhead, who was at the head of this committee that was appointed to find out exactly what had happened in Daviess County and Gallatin election. And he said that every Mormon would be killed unless they complied with the laws of the state. Now, what laws? I don't know. It didn't say specifically. And by what means he would say that every Mormon would be killed, that's not lawful whatsoever. So we see this bullshit death threat rhetoric that Joe and Rigdon were spewing from pulpits. And then we see a judge of the peace, Judge Charles Moorhead, saying that every Mormon would be killed, issuing his own bullshit rhetoric. And he was doing so with a small committee of people behind him. I think it was about 100 people that were essentially his state-sanctioned militia that had ridden up from Richmond. So the rhetoric was being fired both directions, that we will kill anybody that doesn't agree with us, whether it was the Mormons killing Missourians or vice versa. Tensions were high. Now, of course, General Lyman White, being the badass that he was, replied to Judge Charles Moorhead saying, quote, "He owed nothing to the laws had not protected him, he had been on the rack and persecution had followed him these 7 years. He had suffered enough, God did not require him to endure more, and that he would not yield to the laws of Missouri. He would sooner die and be buried," end quote. So, General Lyman White, he was appointed general in the 1834 Zion's Camp. He was essentially the only Mormon there that had, in a leadership position that had actual military training. He was running military drills with Zion's Camp before they got into Missouri, into Caldwell County outside of Jackson. And he himself is saying that, "I'm not going to do what you say. I don't care if you're a state-sanctioned militia that is serving actual legal processes, writs of arrest and subpoenas. He would rather die and be buried." Life or death. This is not fucking around. This is a life or death situations. I mean, and it wasn't just in Daviess County. It wasn't just in Carroll. It wasn't just in Far West or Liberty. I mean, tensions were high everywhere, including Millport. And Millport was just a little mill town. I mean, essentially there was a grocery store, maybe a post office, I doubt it, and then there was a massive grist mill. The Missourians living in Millport were unfriendly to the Mormons as a whole, and every time the Mormons would go to Millport to use the grist mill, their lives were threatened by the Missourians that were living there. Anytime the Mormons would come up and try to use the grist mill, there'd be a mob of, anywhere from 2 or 3 people to, a couple of dozen anti-Mormons that are, "Hey, what are you doing here, bitch?" Right? That's what we're looking at. That's what was going on here. Escalation wasn't just happening at the leadership levels. It was, between typical members of the church and just typical Missourians that hated the Mormons. That was just a constant tension between the two groups. So just for a little bit of context here, Millport was in Daviess County, and it was about 5 miles south of the Mormon settlement, Diahmen, which had some remaining Missourians living there that weren't Mormons. Some of them, like Justice Adam Black, who were anti-Mormons, living near Diahmen or in Diahmen. And of course, Diahmen, where that town received its name, the full name of it was Adam on Diahmen, and it was the town that Joe designated was where Adam and Eve fled to after they were chased out of the Garden of Eden. That was in Jackson County. So essentially, that's what was Jackson County 6,500 years ago, or whenever that happened. And the Zion is where the Garden of Eden is, Jackson County, Independence, Missouri, next to the river there. So when they were chased out, banished from the Garden of Eden, Adam on Diahmen is supposedly where Adam and Eve settled and made their family. Cain killed Abel in... Oh, crap. I can't remember the name of the city, but one of these towns Joe designated as this was the place where Cain killed Abel, and Joe was able to geographically wrap Missouri into the creation narrative somehow. It's really incredible, and people bought it. They were like, oh yeah, that's why this is called Diahmen. Okay, so that then offers some context of the geography of the area. But in early September, George A. Smith, who was cousin to Joe, who had been a member of Zion's camp, along with a man named James Corbett, went to Millport to grind some corn into cornmeal. And as things were already a bit tense, the Missourians in Millport really wanted to fuck with the Mormons any chance that they could get. Now, one of the people living near Millport was our good friend and a loser of the 1838 senatorial election, Robert Peniston. He was living near Millport. He essentially blocked the Mormons' access to the mill, claiming he was no friend of the Mormons with, half a dozen other men there to roadblock Smith and Corbett from even using the mill. A fight nearly broke out again, just like at Gallatin a month earlier, but somehow the situation was allayed. But Josiah Morin, who had won the election against Peniston, just raised a big fucking middle finger to Peniston and said, all right, I'm just going to buy a grist mill and sell it to the Mormons at Diahmen so that the Missourians can no longer stop the Mormons from using the grist mill at Millport. And the Mormons wouldn't, have to fear for their lives every time they needed to grind corn or wheat. So as September progresses, tensions continue to rise and things only become more confusing. Now, to say that all the Mormons and all the Missourians stood in solidarity, bitterly opposed to one another, would be just an oversimplification of the situation. There were plenty of Mormons that just wanted to live their lives and plant their crops without being bothered by the Missourians or the church leadership for that matter. And on the flip side, the majority of Missourians just wanted to live their lives, not caring what their neighbor believes as long as their neighbor's money will spend, and they just don't bother anybody. The problem was the dick size principle. That's the principle where one guy feels threatened by another guy. So he has to whip out his dick and prove that his dick is bigger than the other guy's dick. So Joe and Rigdon were being called out by the Missourians basically to show everybody the size of their dicks. Are they willing to follow through on their threats of violence? They'd been preaching from the pulpit that their dicks are bigger than everybody else's, especially those anti-morbid mobocrats. Were they going to back it up with an actual measurement? So then the elected officials in Missouri, who were Boggs and Diahmen, Atchison, Peniston, Black, etc., they had heard that the Mormons had really big dicks and that they're just waving them around for all to see in Davies and Carroll and Caldwell and Clay counties. And what happens when a group of guys thinks another group of guys have bigger dicks? Well, they have to fuck the guys claiming they have the bigger dicks until they can dominate the other bigger dick group. Why do you think white men have oppressed black men for so long? They know for a fact that black men's dicks are bigger, so the white men have to repeatedly fuck the black men to stay dominant. Humans have been playing this game of bones for hundreds of thousands of years, and I would assume that our hominid ancestors did the same thing. The problem rests with the large group of people being led by insecure dicks with small dicks that want everybody to know just how big their dick supposedly is. Even if it requires some grand public gestures and marching bodies of men around, into the sound of battle drums hit with dick-shaped drumsticks and shooting their dick-shaped bullets at each other. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that outside this small group of men on either side that were constantly ruminating about how big the other group's dicks are, the vast majority of the people living under these moronic alpha males just wanted to live their lives without being constantly fucked by dicks, big or small. And people are simple that way. I mean, you give them a place to live and grow crops and shit in peace, they'll just keep doing that for generations until they die. That was the American dream back then. But instead, we have Joe and Rigdon on one side and the anti-Mormon-Missouri government on the other side of this cockflict, and they dragged everybody along behind them. The majority of Missourians didn't care what the Mormons did or believed as long as it didn't infringe on their rights in any way. And on the flip side of that, the majority of Mormons were glad to be living in Davies or Caldwell or Clay or any of these other local counties and just live their lives. They didn't want to start any shit with the Missourians. They were outnumbered nearly everywhere. The Mormons just wanted land to farm and to be able to put food in their mouths and raise their children peacefully, but the leadership of both sides of the conflict would not allow that to happen. It could have de-escalated. Everybody could have walked away and said, let's just live our lives and be cool with each other, but that was never going to happen. But what we're studying right now is some highly biased history, right? All history is biased in some way, but this is very, very biased. We're studying the events that were exciting enough to merit print, but those events only involved small groups of people. I mean, most of the people living in Missouri at this time were just farming and tanning and making goods and providing services, just living their lives in frontier Missouri. And they were just sitting back and spectating everything that we read about now, only they were seeing it play out in front of them, and there was the unknown certainty of the fog of the future, right? I mean, we're looking back on this with hindsight. We know what happens a month after this, but when they were experiencing this, they didn't know what was going to happen. But nobody writes in their journal entries about how good the farming was and how nice the weather treated their crops because they were too preoccupied with militias being raised and marching across county lines to enforce the will of those with small dicks. John Corrill was a Mormon living in Far West. Now, I think I've said his name a couple of times before, but nothing's coming to mind right now because this guy hasn't really been terribly significant in our timeline. But there have been occasional times when he's come up in my reading, and maybe I've said him on the show once or twice. But I'm going to read an excerpt from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur, which has been one of my main resources I've been relying on heavily to understand this 1 year extracted out of history, because this year from March of 1838 to March of 39 is just chaos and pandemonium, and I'm really working hard to try and get a grasp of it, but it's so confusing. But this is from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur, quote, "In late August, John Corrill told some Mormons who had newly arrived in Far West that he did not think the Mormons were duty-bound to join the United Firms," meaning to consecrate all of their property. He said, I don't want to give all of my shit to the church, only to have it given, a little bit of it given back to me. It continues, and, quote, "he had no confidence in the revelation that required it. Smith and Rigdon, upon hearing this remark, reprimanded Corrill for making such expressions in the presence of brethren who might perhaps be weak in the faith." So, like, Corrill, stop talking about this when there are people around that are listening. Shut the fuck up, dude. We'll talk about this later, right? Of course, they were weak in the faith, right? I mean, they'd just been forced to move 1,000 miles in the hottest part of summer because the Kirtland Church had excommunicated Joe and Rigdon, and they somehow were dragged from Ohio to Missouri because Joe and Rigdon moved the church headquarters to far west. I mean, it's confusing, but you can imagine how it might have been a trial for some of these people to reconcile their beliefs in the one true God when all that ever happens is they just unendingly get shat on constantly. Now it goes back to quoting Joseph here, quote, "If you tell about the streets again that you do not believe this or that revelation, I will walk on your neck, sir." Walk on your neck? Continuing, the prophet told Coral as he smacked his fists together to illustrate his point. Coral replied that he would not yield his judgment to anything proposed by the church or by individuals in the church or by Joseph Smith, even when Smith purported to be speaking for God. Coral said he was a Republican. Consequently, he would do, say, act, and believe what he pleased. Now, back to quoting Joseph. "If you do not act differently and show yourself approved, you shall never be admitted into the kingdom of heaven," Smith responded. "I will stand at the entrance and oppose you myself, and will keep you out if I have to take a fisticuff in doing it." Now, this is how Coral replied, quote, "I may possibly get there first," end quote. It's a common Mormon belief that the judgment seat will hold the Godhead, God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost, and that Joe will also be sitting up on the judgment stand. That Joe will also have a say whether or not you get into heaven. So let's just say that Coral was a great guy his entire life. And this is, of course, granting Mormon beliefs, truth to Mormon beliefs. Coral's a great guy. He gets to heaven and Smith is there. God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost say, John, you were a good guy. Remember when you saved that homeless family and gave them a barrel of wheat because you knew that they were going to die and not get through the winter. They were going to starve if they didn't have something to eat. Yeah, you're a good guy. You believed in God your entire life. You're getting into heaven. You get my stamp of approval. 3 yeses. God, yes. Jesus, yes. Holy Ghost, yeah. Rubber stamp. Get him on through here. But Joe is gonna sit up there on the stand and tell Coral, "You were an asshole to me, and you claimed that we are not the true church. And, you walked around the streets saying that you do not believe this or that revelation. I'm going to walk on your neck. And even if I have to take a fisticuff, I will not let you into the kingdom of God because you were mean to me." That's the Joseph Smith we're dealing with here. Isn't that remarkable? That is Joe. How petty and just childish is this? That Joe was so pissed off at John Coral that he said, I'm going to stand personally at the gates of heaven and stop you from entering the kingdom of God. What a little bitch. I say that about Joe whenever he does these little bitch moves, whenever he is there's just no better word for it. When somebody is just being a little bitch about something, that's the best thing to call them. And that's what Joe was doing. He was being a little bitch. And I can imagine that John Coral was like, okay, fuck you. I'll get to heaven first and I'll stop you from getting into heaven, Joe. I mean, this is really an incredible mindset that these people had that we're dealing with. But Joe figured himself above everybody else and claimed, I will be able to stop you from getting into heaven. What an asshole. But of course, this was just infighting. And that's why I included this, is because it illustrates that not everybody on the Mormon side was on board with what Joe and Rigdon were doing. There were at least some people like John Corll who were raising a hand and saying, hey, have we thought about not raising an army to march against the Missouri mob? Have we ever thought about not doing the worst possible idea? Have we ever tried not being fucking idiots? Like, no, kick that guy out. That guy's talking too much sense. Get him out of here. It's incredible. And it also goes without saying that the majority of Missourians didn't really care about the Mormons. I mean, in some of these, smaller population areas when, the families were actually affected by the actions of the Mormons, yes, they cared, but the vast majority of the population was like, yeah, they're just kooky. They're just weird. They read that gold Bible. Let them do it. Their money still spends. I mean, it's really incredible, but that doesn't go to say that there was going to be, de-escalation if they just kick out some dissenters in the group or anything to that effect. I mean, things continued to escalate. Things continued to get worse. So in anticipation of more Mormon violence, Lilburn Boggs, who will be a centerpiece of anti-Mormon violence very soon, Lilburn Boggs, who was governor of Missouri, elected in 1836, organized an armed militia of 500 men in Richmond who were bound for Daviess County in order to detain and hold a trial for the Mormon leadership and the leadership of the Danites. But Boggs was working off of rumors that the Mormons had acted with hostility and had taken Missourians captive. Those were false rumors. So once those rumors were dispelled, Boggs essentially just disbanded the militia. This militia, don't get me wrong, a lot of the people were really excited to go march against the Mormons, go lay siege to Diahmen or far west. They disbanded, and a lot of them were, really aching to show the Mormons in Diahmen or far west just how big their dicks are. But alas, it was allayed at the time. But that was only a temporary respite, as the militia would be gathered once again and multiple times after this in half a month's time to actually march and lay siege to DeWitt and far west. Unfortunately for us, those will have to be topics discussed upon the arrival of the new year. Now, I'm really trying to make sense of all this chaos. All right. Today's episode only covered a month and a half of time, and so much happened. Most of the time was focused on just 1 week. But trust me, I left out a lot of details that would have just made everything more confusing. I'm just trying to hit on the most important points that drive the story forward, that move us further along in the timeline, because there was so much going on in multiple different areas that it's hard to give them all equal representation and discuss them as if all of them are included in this massive timeline. When I make references real quick to like DeWitt in Carroll County and, Millport in Daviess County, like these, there was a lot going on at each and every one of these towns, but we're just, grabbing up little tiny snapshots out of each one as those little snapshots played into the bigger puzzle that is the year of 1838 in Missouri. But that goes with saying that so much of what I am studying right now is just endlessly fascinating. I say that phrase often, endlessly fascinating, because that's the only way to describe it. No matter how much I'm studying this, I'm using the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur as one of my primary resources for this, as known to be one of the best history books covering this time period. But of course, I'm still reading through this in like the rise of Mormonism through this time. I'm cross-referencing things through that, as well as through the Sidney Rigdon by Richard Van Wagner, Portrait of Religious Excess. All of these books cover the time of 1838, and each one of them hit on different points. Very few situations are repeated throughout these books because So it's like Stephen LeSueur already covered this, so why would H. Michael Marquardt need to cover it in The Rise of Mormonism as well? But it's like, I'm trying to gather all of these together. I'm trying to synthesize these all together in a palpable timeline, and it's just utterly confusing, but fun. I like to challenge my brain on these things. I like to really give my brain something to chew on for a while, and that's what we're going through right now. Now, of course, once again, my apologies that this episode was not quite as well prepared for, but like I said at the beginning of the episode, I had a bit less time to prepare this episode because, essentially the work that I had done on it for the past week and a half, 2 weeks, was lost to cyberspace. But that being said, like this timeline is so important to us. And I really want to thank Lloyd for sending that Reed Peck manuscript, because that's a firsthand witness account that I was unaware of. And reading that firsthand, essentially a journal entry written in 1839, it was recalled less than a year after these things happened. It adds some much needed first-person perspective. So to Lloyd and to any listener who wants to send their research in or send in things that they are aware of, specifically if it's covering this time in 1838 in Missouri, I'm trying to absorb as much possible information that I can here to deliver this in a palpable format. This year is far more monumental than most years in Mormon history. More things happen in this year to set up Mormonism in Nauvoo in the long run than in any other time in all of Mormon history. This is a hinge pin year. And the people that we are dealing with here, just reading one or two persons' first-person perspective doesn't really enlighten us to how the feeling was at the time. We can read about this, this brawl that broke out at Gallatin election day, or these mobs that were marching across county lines illegally, or this situation with Justice Adam Black and Joe essentially marching an armed mob of 100 men to surround Black's home in order to force him to sign something under duress. I mean, all of these are, smaller pieces of a massive puzzle, and we're only getting access. The only things that are written in the history books are the more sensational and exciting parts. Very few people, as I said earlier, talk about, it was a good day of farming today, and, I played catch with my son. People don't report that because it's not interesting. And if they do in their journal entries, those days are skipped over because there's nothing there. There's nothing sensational and exciting. But every person that was going through all of these really crazy and intense situations, they're all people. They all experienced stress and fear and anger and hatred and love and happiness and appreciation the way that we experience those emotions. Not for the same reasons, of course, but they still felt the same emotions that you or I feel today when we experience similar things. But there's no way to put ourselves into the shoes of these Mormons or these Missourians at the time. And everybody thought that they were on the right side. There was nobody that was, acting out of malicious intent saying, I am an anti-Mormon because I hate the Mormons' beliefs. There may have been some, but the majority of people were pissed off at the Mormons because of their radical authority claims to be speaking for God, their shitty business practices, their counterfeit money, their law of consecration and communalism, their teaching slaves how to read the Book of Mormon. My God, that was a huge sticking point with the Missourians. You start teaching their slaves how to read, we got some really big fucking problems. The real estate practices that were performed on both sides, trying to attain each other's land through loopholes in the legal system of newly appropriated land settlement from the United States government. I mean, so much of what we're talking about here is contingent on what the Mormons were doing and has nothing to do with the fact that they were Mormons. But it does feel good to, I guess, we can rest assured that Joe and Rigdon were the primary problem here. They figured themselves invincible, unattainable. They had dodged the law so many times before now. They thought the law can't get us, and even if the law does get us, we are held to a higher law, and we are accountable to God, not to men. I mean, like, what did that guy say? I'll assassinate Van Buren. Let the consequences be what they may. I follow the law of the Lord. That's terrifying. And I guess that's probably what comes most into conflict with the simplistic narrative that I was sold as a young kid in the Mormon church. And I'm sure that many of you that grew up in the church or have, heard anything or experienced any of the history of Mormonism, I'm sure you were sold the same simplistic narrative that these are anti-Mormons. They hated Joe because he was the one true prophet. That's just such grade A bullshit. That is such an oversimplification. It's not even a generalization. It's just essentially wrong. It's almost to the point of not even being wrong, because it just ignores so much of the truth. It ignores so much of the history. Now, granted, this is biased history. All history is biased, and that's what we're reading. But just because a historical source is biased doesn't mean it's unreliable. And when we see Reed Peck's recounting of the situation, or Ebenezer Robinson, or Philo Dibble Dabble, or, William Wines Phelps, or any of these people, we see their firsthand accounts, it really enlightens us to the fact that the idea that all of the violence that the Mormons experienced just boils down to religious persecution is just simply wrong. Don't get me wrong, it's a small piece of the puzzle, but without that piece of it, this is, it doesn't make quite as much sense. But thing is if you pull the religion out of the equation, all of the persecution and the frustrations that happened still would have happened. There wouldn't have been any religious basis for it. But if you remove the Kirtland Safety Society, anti-banking company, their counterfeit money, if you remove that from the equation, things are vastly different. If you remove their land speculation in Jackson County, things are vastly different. If you remove the Mormons being chased out of Jackson County in 1833 in the first place, that was essentially just due to greedy land grabbing by the Missourians. If you remove that from the equation, none of this happens. But the religion, if you take that out of the equation, it's just one small piece. Things might be slightly different, but everything that happened probably still would have happened the way that it did. These groups just would have found some other way to balkanize and rise against each other. Pointing to the religious piece of it and saying that is holds sole responsibility for why the Mormons were so viciously persecuted and beat, tarred, whipped, shot at, killed, stabbed. It's just too simplistic. It's not just the religion that did it. And maybe that's the takeaway for this episode, right? Step back. Get a holistic picture of the situation. The odds are, if you feel like something is simple and you understand it, the odds are that it's not that simple and that it requires a step even further back and a broader perspective to understand everything that was going on. And that's what we're trying to do through this 1838. It's chaos. The only word I can describe. It's just, looking back on it, we can see the writing on the wall. We know how each individual action led to the cause of the next, led to the next effect, which caused the next effect, which caused the next effects, ad infinitum. We can look at it back behind us and say, yeah, we know what happened, but it's really important to understand that the people living then sure as shit didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were scared for their lives on a day-to-day basis. They lived in the constant fear, whether you were living in Millport or Far West or Diahmen or DeWitt, any of these towns, you lived under the constant fear that someday that mob might show up, and the only answer you have is either run or die. I'm just sitting here in my comfortable apartment wondering what that might be like. That's terrifying. And I'm glad that we've advanced society to the point that we don't have to deal with that threat all day, every day. I'm thankful I don't live in 1838. And I feel terrible for these people that did have to experience this shit, because it's like, this was life and death for them. Whether it was getting enough crops to last through the winter, or whether it was, armed mobs of hundreds of men that were marching or laying siege to a town. Like, this is life or death for these people. And it just adds to the richness and beauty of Mormon history. And I just love it so much. And that is it for the historical portion of this episode. Once again, I do have to essentially apologize for not being quite as well prepared for this episode as I like to be. As I said at the beginning of the episode, I've essentially lost a few weeks of work, and included was this episode. So I kind of had to throw this thing back together over the past 2 days. And hopefully it didn't show too much, but this is a little bit more vamping than I usually do. The script was a little bit shorter than usual, but hopefully it still filled out the usual time frame of the historical episodes. I'm looking at my recorder. Yeah, over an hour and a half. That seems about right for a historical timeline episode, right? Hopefully you guys don't get completely sick of hearing my voice. Otherwise, you just wouldn't listen. And I don't want that to happen. I love you guys. I love all of the listeners. You guys are fantastic. And I do want to extend out a thanks for all of you listening in to the podcast. This month was going to be a 5-episode month, but because of this loss of data, it is, I'm cutting that back. It's going to just be a 4-episode month, and the episode that normally would come out on December 29th, that's just going to be a non-episode week. And then we'll jump right back on the bandwagon beginning in early January. We'll get right into the rest of this Gallatin election battle and the effects of it on the larger scheme of things. Because this is, the keg has been lit. The powder magazine in this fort of Mormonism has exploded, and nobody has realized it yet. Things only escalate from here. But yeah, so tune in next week to hear the discussion with Cody. I'm really excited about that. And until then, we'll have to sign off and call it an episode. Of course, I did have a couple of patrons to thank. Looks like we have a new NAMO juvenile delinquent, Lisa, and a new NAMO adolescent rebel, Vance. Thank you both so very much for your support on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Your support helps this research be done and produced into a palpable podcast format. That's what your funding is, the help for research. So thank you all so very much. And of course, there are our patron Hall of Famers. These are the Namo demons and greater who occupy the great outer darkness. So thank you all to Preston, Jay, Chris and Christy, Tyler, Judy, Frank, Clara, Dario, Randy, Mindy, Matthew, Karen, Colette, Shelley, Greg, James, and Eric. Thank you all so much for being in Nemo Outer Darkness and providing that level of support that really puts you in the Hall of Fame of making this a true full-time endeavor. And thank you all to any patron who does support the show at any level. Your pledges are very gracious and deeply appreciated from myself and from the people who get to listen to this because I'm able to produce it for full time. Thank you all. And that is it for the episode. We'll do listener mail segment probably after the new year because with traveling and whatnot with the holidays, there's always chaos. But of course, I need to thank a few people before closing it down for tonight. First, I'll start off by thanking Demonista for running the Facebook page. I also need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork that's used in this show with his permission. Please check out his blog at weirdmormonshit.com. I need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music that's used in the show with his permission. Go to A Lost State of Mind to download his music. If you want to leave a voicemail on the show that can be played in the next historical episode, that's 864-NAKED-MO, 864-625-3366. You can talk about your personal story or an interaction that you had with a missionary or on the chat log on Mormon.com, or just literally anything you want to talk about. You can leave a voicemail there and it'll be played in the show. Of course, I need to thank all of the people who support the show on Patreon.com. Once again, it is very nice of you to do such nice things for me. And of course, I need to thank very most of all of you wonderful listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Alright, my computer might have been completely fucked over, but at least I still got a bonus for you. This is a letter from Hiram Comstock. Now, this hopefully enlightens us a little bit as to the rumors that were surrounding, and this was written August 12th, so just a few days after the Gallatin election, and it was sent to the citizens of Carroll County. This is a quote from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri by Stephen LeSueur. Quote, he reported that the Mormons had overrun Daviess County, destroyed crops, threatened the lives of prominent citizens, threatened to attack Jackson County, and were fortifying for a siege in far west. Comstock also reported that the citizens of Daviess County had sent representatives to Clay, Ray, Jackson, and Lafayette counties, but it was seriously believed that the Mormons had captured and killed them. End quote. Wow. That was the level of rumors that we're talking about here. Big battle happened. People are dying all over the place. The Mormons are, fortifying their towns for sieges. They destroyed crops. They burned through Daviess County and looted and pillaged everything. They were threatening the lives of Adam Black and other prominent citizens. Some of it's true, but most of it is scary and actionable. When you're a governor that's saying, how the fuck do I deal with the Mormons? Oh, wow, we got a real big problem out here. Yeah, it's wonderful. The preceding podcast has been a production of Ground Gnomes, LLC, all rights reserved.